Thank you, Buddha. For everyone joining us now, I am Indrajit Roy, Senior Lecturer in Global Development Politics at the University of York. I'm privileged to convene the Reimagining Citizenship Research Consortium, which aims to chronicle the emergent contentions of citizenship in India in the wake of the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act enacted in December 2019. That project draws on arts and humanities research and blends it with social science perspectives. And it's a consortium in collaboration with public intellectuals, filmmakers, academics, activists, and poets, and supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the UK. Today, I am truly grateful that Professor Faisal Devji agreed to deliver the keynote at the Reimagining Citizenship in South Asia conference. Professor Devji probably needs no introduction to this audience. He has held, as Buddha mentioned, he's currently at St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford, but prior to that, he has held faculty positions at the New School in New York, at Yale University, and at the University of Chicago, from where you also received your PhD in intellectual history. Professor Devji was a junior fellow at the Society of Fellows at Harvard and the head of graduate studies at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, where he directed postgraduate courses in the Near East and Central Asia. So not just South Asia or India, but there's also a vaster canvas. He's a fellow at New York University's Institute of Public Knowledge and the Viz Othraman Chair at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. And also an editorial board member of the journal Public Culture. More generally, Professor Devji's interests are in Indian political thought, as well as that of modern Islam. And more broadly, I suppose, to do with ethics and violence in a globalized world. His most recent publication, but I may be outdated here, so correct me if I'm wrong, Faisal, was Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a political idea, or is there something that's come up after that which I've missed? Okay, sorry. Anyway, and prior to that, there was the book on Gandhi, which was titled The Impossible India, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence. And then there was The Terrorist in Search of Humanity, Militant Islam and Global Politics. And prior to that was Landscapes of the Jihad, Militancy, Morality, and Modernity. Today, Faisal is going to talk to us about the significance of 1971 and what it means for the post-colonial state. So without further ado, I will hand over to Faisal. I do want to say that we will have no question and answers at the end of the session. So if you do have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and Faisal may choose to respond to them afterwards, perhaps over email or offline, but we will not be able to have a Q&A for this keynote. With that apology, as it were, but also introduction, Faisal, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Indrajit and Buddha, for inviting me to this wonderful conference. In order to keep to my allotted time, I hope you won't mind me plunging straight into the paper and reading it out. Otherwise, I know I'm so prolix, I'll just end up speaking for 45 minutes. So obviously, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the emergence of Bangladesh. I thought, therefore, it would be appropriate to focus my comments or my paper on it and the new kind of citizenship that it seems to found. So one of the most significant global events in the second half of the 20th century, the violent founding of Bangladesh in 1971, has nevertheless received little scholarly attention. What exists of it has been dominated by the international community's vocabulary of genocide and crimes against humanity that found one of its earliest causes in the 1971 war. Within its own neighborhood, however, the creation of Bangladesh has been seen as a historical repetition. It is sometimes said to repeat the partition of India in 1947 by dividing Pakistan to belatedly confirm the victory of secular over religious nationalism. But the war can also be understood as repeating the first partition of Bengal in 1905, with the region's eastern part finally achieving its independence in 1971. The logic of repetition to which the erstwhile East Pakistan is subjected occurs within the context of Pakistan's own history as well. Having been founded to prevent India's Muslims from being reduced to a national minority, Pakistan was faced after independence with the problem of ensuring the Bengali majority of its eastern wing did not turn the West's population into another minority. The one unit policy adopted by the state, which amalgamated all of West Pakistan's provinces into a single unit so as to balance East Pakistan's numerical dominance, also appeared to repeat the Muslim League's colonial policy of claiming parity between Hindus and Muslims in India. The specter of the minority that Pakistan was meant to exorcise therefore continued to haunt it after independence. In all these partisan ways, Bangladesh has been assimilated to the past of its predecessors, as if it came into existence to repeat, if not fulfill their histories, as yet another post-colonial state. Yet it is the only country in South Asia not to emerge directly from the region's decolonization, and its nationality was in fact constructed against that of the post-colonial state, even as it assumed many of the latter's characteristics. Might 1971 then be understood as closing the post-colonial period that had opened with the independence of India and Pakistan? I shall argue here that Bangladesh represents the inauguration of a new kind of nation and citizenship for which imperialism and anti-colonialism have been replaced by civil war as both the chief problem and possibility of liberation globally. So rather than reproducing or even correcting Indian and Pakistani history, Bangladesh can be said to rewrite it. The emergence of partition as a subject of scholarly and cultural attention in India and later Pakistan from the 1980s, for example, not only follows upon the latter's violent division, but is marked by the humanitarian themes of trauma and memory that were pioneered in 1971. Such themes had not previously defined writing and reflection about 1947. In the process, partition has lost its political character as a battle between communities, parties, ideologies, or states to become the story of crimes perpetrated by individuals on all sides with the breakdown of the colonial administration. And we shall see that depoliticization is precisely what has come to characterize one rendition of Bangladeshi history and politics. A great deal of scholarship on South Asia continues to harp upon the colonial inheritance of its states and their incomplete national projects, itself a theme of right-wing politics in all these countries. But the creation of Bangladesh dispenses with this debate by closing the narrative of the post-colonial state that had opened with the independence of India and Pakistan. Ria Kapoor, for instance, argues that the history of 1947 came to an end in the 1971 war, whose contending parties refused for the first time to consider what should have been the familiar violence and refugees produced by it as part of the logic of decolonization. The millions of East Pakistani refugees in India, whether Hindu or Muslim, were not therefore seen as former and possibly future Indians, but as neighbors deserving at most of humanitarian treatment. The reasons for this novel political and juridical attitude are clear. India did not want to be seen as undoing the sovereignty of a neighboring rival because of her eagerness to retain a leading role in anti-imperialist politics globally, for which the post-colonial state's sovereignty had become sacrosanct. Kapoor, for instance, shows how Indira Gandhi's government had recourse to the strained argument that it was actually supporting the majority of the Pakistani people in its eastern wing against an illegitimate and even secessionist military dictatorship in the West. Pakistan, for its part, would not countenance the recognition of Muslims from her former province as would-be Indians. This does not mean, of course, that Bangladesh hasn't in fact inherited anything from either the colonial or post-colonial state, only that the former seems to have lost all political resonance there, while the latter, in the shape of Pakistan, remains even today by far the greater enemy and even threat to Bangladeshi citizenship and national identity. What are we to make of a situation in which imperialism possesses little or no political meaning for national identity in a South Asian country while its war of liberation against a post-colonial state deploys a trope unavailable to its neighbors. India and Pakistan, after all, emerged as the result of a negotiated settlement, with the violence that engulfed them at independence being directed not against the British, but their own religious minorities, and resulting eventually in a war between the two new states. While colonial rule certainly provided the historical context for all this, in reality, it had already receded as a threat or figuration of enmity by 1947 to become a kind of political pretext for India and Pakistan. With the birth of Bangladesh, even this pretext has vanished, along with colonialism itself. Nayanaka Mukherjee has pointed out, moreover, that public memory in Bangladesh has even come to repudiate South Asia as the context of its freedom, instead placing the humanitarian crisis that attended it within a global history of genocide for which imperialism too is of no particular consequence. Bangladesh, in other words, departed the narrative logic of decolonization that characterized her neighbors, while at the same time making visible their own disavowed history of civil war. Yet this history was obscured the moment it became manifest in 1971, which is why, in another sense, in another case of repetition, the terminology of empire has had to be recycled in Bangladesh to describe Pakistan as a colonial power from which liberation was gained by force of arms. Bangladesh managed to lend historical reality to a war of liberation that remains a fantasy in India and Pakistan, one linked to limited and unsuccessful movements like that represented by the Indian National Army during the Second World War. But in doing so, it also set aside the narrative of civil war, which had been adopted by West Pakistan's military rulers to describe the struggle that became the 1971 war. Yet it is strange that General Yahya Khan's regime should have deployed the category of civil war rather than the more familiar terms sedition, riot, or even the kind of emergency that Mrs. Gandhi's government would invoke a few years later in India to describe a conflict which it claimed was within its sovereign jurisdiction. For civil war differs from domestic disturbances precisely because it puts the sovereignty of a state into question and thus permits international intervention. Whatever the reasons behind this choice of names, which Zobia Haq, a doctoral student at the University of Oxford, is exploring in her research on political thought during the 1971 war, I will suggest that the idea of civil war was by no means a novel one in the history of colonial India. Civil war there had been used to name Hindu-Muslim conflict in particular, and the story of how this term came to acquire a more capacious meaning in the region is full of interest. This is, I might mention by way of passing, this is a story that is brilliantly evoked and told in a forthcoming book by Shruti Kapila called Violent Fraternity, published by Princeton. More than a regional history, however, I want to argue that civil war names the global future of political founding, one that was inaugurated by the emergence of Bangladesh in 1971. But if civil war disappeared from Bangladeshi narratives, it is not only because the term was deployed by West Pakistan and so had to be replaced by a war of liberation taken from the repertoire of anti-colonialism. Also important was the fact that the nation in Bangladesh was often imagined to have been founded upon the depoliticized language of international humanitarianism, with its focus on individual crimes often defined by the ethnic and religious identities of their alleged perpetrators, Punjabi against Bengali and fundamentalist against secularist. India first put this language to use in drumming up international support against Pakistan, but it was soon taken up by proponents of human rights elsewhere. As a result, Bangladesh can be seen as the first state founded in the name of humanitarianism, setting the precedent for Bosnia, Kosovo, East Timor, and South Sudan in later decades. And while these new countries were founded by the collective intervention of the international community, in the case of Bangladesh, it was India which arrogated to itself the responsibility to act in that community's name. It was one of the first countries to intervene for the cause of what today we call the right to protect. The depoliticized and internationalist language of genocide and crimes against humanity that came to define one version of Bangladeshi nationalism has not remained confined to discussions of its founding. Depending as it did for decades on aid and other assistance following independence, Bangladesh was in some sense a ward of the international order, just as Bosnia, Kosovo, East Timor, South Sudan, or the Palestinian Authority are today. And this meant the further depoliticization of its public life, which was given over to humanitarianism in another kind, in serving as an experimental site for development and disaster relief, financed and often led by foreign donors. Such depoliticization has only been exacerbated by bouts of military rule, supposedly in the interests of stability and development, as well as in the occasional and internationally supported imposition of non-political caretaker administrations in Bangladesh. This is not to say, of course, that Bangladesh possesses no political language or imagination, only that the circumstances of its founding have resulted in the emergence of a significant and anti-political narrative there. This is only exacerbated by the ambiguity, if not absence, of any national narrative about Bengali Muslims struggling for freedom before 1971, and the problem posed by their participation in the movement for Pakistan before 1947. Bengal, after all, played a more crucial role than any other part of the future state in its creation, having been a Muslim League province longer than any other and provided Pakistan with several of its leaders. All of this has no doubt led the suppression of political history in Bangladesh and its replacement by the story of a crime to which all anti-government opposition, even in the present, is reduced. This was clear in the International Crimes Tribunal set up by the Bangladeshi government in 2009, which was widely accused of lacking independence and impartiality while being riddled by procedural improprieties. It serves as yet another example of how political disagreement and conflict can be denied recognition and institutionalization while being understood as criminality. The depoliticized language of humanitarianism, of course, was only put in place once India, receiving millions of refugees from East Pakistan, decided to intervene in what was quickly becoming a civil war and then one of liberation. Before this, the struggle in Pakistan had possessed any number of political dimensions. Srinath Raghavan, in one of the only serious studies of the 1971 war, describes how the desire for political, economic, and cultural autonomy in East Pakistan had a quite different national as well as international resonance. On the one hand, regional parties in the West made common cause with the East in a national endeavor. And on the other, mass mobilization against the government was spearheaded by students as part of a global wave of protests in 1968. These initial stages of the conflict have been little examined by scholars, and Zobia Haq's research do much to illuminate their political meaning. Equally important as a subject for research is the history of anti-political or at least depoliticized ways of considering conflict in Bangladesh. While they may have emerged out of the humanitarian crisis of the 1971 war, which quickly became a global cause, such ways of understanding conflict are neither unique to Bangladesh nor restricted to the themes of genocide and crimes against humanity. It would be interesting, for example, to see how the wartime language of humanitarianism might have facilitated the emergence of neoliberalism as yet another anti-political mode of understanding and regulating conflict. This would allow for a new history connecting the country's violent origins with the economic success it enjoys today as a result of the post-Cold War dominance of neoliberal policies in the international order. But what I want to do here is to attend to the prehistory of civil war in colonial India and close with some reflections on its global consequences for our own time. For civil war comprises, in my view, the disavowed politics both of late colonial India and of the post-colonial world more generally. And it was civil war that was brought to the fore by the founding of Bangladesh. Now, considering the possibilities for religious harmony in 1925, the Indian nationalist leader Lala Lajpat Rai reiterated what had become a familiar argument, that the system of communal representation set up by the British in India encouraged the emergence of a competitive politics between Hindus and Muslims. with each institutionally entrenched as an interest group, he predicted, and neither inclined to give up the advantages this brought, such a system of differential representation could not be abolished without a civil war. By the 1930s, with the widening of the franchise and the increased responsibility of Indians in government, both the Muslim thinker Muhammad Iqbal and the Indian leader M.K. Gandhi were describing communal violence in terms of a civil war hidden in plain sight. These statements attributed religious conflict and especially the possibility of civil war not to any ancient quarrel between Hindus and Muslims, but rather to their transformation into liberal and therefore competitive interests by way of representative institutions, precisely the institutions of citizenship. Both men thought that interests, which were defined, they understood in terms of property of various kinds, could only characterize capitalist societies where all social relations were mediated by ownership. But since this was not the case in India, and nor each one thought should it ever be, religious and other identities were only half constructed as interests and increasingly played a destructive role in the country's social and political life. For Gandhi, the development of liberal interests, and particularly the self-interest that was their conceptual as much as juridical foundation, were not marks of progress, but made for India's colonization through the desire for British merchandise, protection, and the like. As early as his 1909 manifesto, Hind Swaraj, he had argued that they only existed in the interface between Indians and the colonial state, the latter offering itself as a neutral third party mediating the relations between its subjects. Indians were unable to deal directly with one another, either as individuals or groups, and so in those places where the state's reach was weak, could only be juxtaposed against one another. This he called divide and rule, considered as a structural consequence rather than intentional policy of British rule. Iqbal turned to thinking about alternative ways in which disinterested relations might be retrieved or created between Indians. He did so in part philosophically and politically, but mostly aesthetically through his immensely popular poetry. Gandhi sought to recover and strengthen such disinterested relations, that is to say, relations between peoples and groups that were not defined by group interests as represented in seats in legislatures, for instance, in which ownership, of course, was crucial. So Gandhi sought to recover and strengthen such disinterested relations by expanding the everyday sacrifices that marked the lives of relatives and friends into larger and larger contexts through his nonviolent mobilizations. Accused of reactionary sentiments and nostalgia for the pre-modern past, both men were opposed by their peers who also thought it was the incomplete hegemony of liberal interests in India that produced communal violence. But they saw the solution in further modernizing social relations so as to make property their basis. Of course, the biggest form of property of all was the nation state, seen as a collective property. The nation state also guaranteed more particular forms of ownership. Now, Iqbal died in 1938, a decade before independence, while by 1942, Gandhi had come to the same conclusion as Lajpat Rai in 1925. But instead of trying to forestall a civil war, he began to see it as a tragic opportunity for non-violence and its disinterested relations. During the Quit India movement of 1942, Gandhi asked the British to leave without settling the country's constitutional future, which he thought they were incapable of doing by the logic of their institutions. Wedded to the liberal common sense of third-party mediation, the colonial state was unable to resolve the conflicts it had done so much to exacerbate in India. Its former subjects would have to risk civil war to rebuild relations in the absence of this third party, and by shifting from mere juxtaposition to mutual trust, sacrifice, and friendship. Gandhi thought that the unmediated and so perversely intimate and violent relations of a civil war might be capable of forcing its belligerents to finally assume responsibility for their common future, one they had so far had the luxury of disdaining, having been rendered literally irresponsible by colonial rule. He did not desire such a war, but saw it as a possible and in parts inevitable consequence of colonial liberalism. When independence did come, the violence that accompanied, and defined it was seen by many as a kind of civil war, one that threatened to overwhelm the authority of the new state succeeding British rule. Shruti Kapila, in a discussion of the political thought of India's first Home Minister, Vallabhbhai Patel, brings out the hidden reality of the civil war in the making of India's republic. Partition preempted the possibility of a widespread civil war, the kind that Gandhi actually wanted, and internationalized it as interstate conflict between India and Pakistan. While this institutionalization of conflict subordinated it to the laws of war, however, much of the deferred civil war's violence was left to play itself out in the domestic arena of both countries, where it continues to take the unregulated form of pogroms and massacres. As international conflict, in other words, violence became political, while in the national arena it remains criminal. In 1971, the specter of civil war returned to create a new sovereign state in South Asia, yet its violence can no longer be confined to domestic riots and has come to define Bangladeshi nationalism by subordinating it to the narrative of humanitarianism and crime. Bangladesh has not only inherited its national narrative from the colonial past and the humanitarianism which justified it, but also represents a major site of its transformation in today's international order. But this depoliticized and criminalizing narrative is unable fully to disguise the country's secret history of civil war. And I would like to suggest that it is this that links it to a global future. Just as Bangladesh was founded against the post-colonial nation state in such a way as to forget or depoliticize its own anti-colonial history, so too has it left the logic of decolonization behind to initiate a new historical sequence defined by civil war. Deferred by the creation of India and Pakistan and provincialized as crime in their domestic arenas, civil war, I have suggested, came to the fore again in 1971 with the founding of Bangladesh. But even as it too was sometimes depoliticized by the new state, initially in the vocabulary of genocide and crimes against humanity that had come to define the international order, and later in that of neoliberalism, the civil war that gave rise to Bangladesh marks the novelty of its independence. While colonial India was not the only part of the world in which the transition from empire to nation state entailed finessing civil war as a transfer of power, Bangladesh was one of the first to put an end to this logic. By closing the history of postcolonialism that had begun in 1947, its creation opened a new way of periodizing the emergence of new states globally. After all, if we discount latecomers like South Africa, whose independence cannot in any case be adequately understood in terms of decolonization, it becomes clear that Bangladesh was the first country born out of the destruction of the post-colonial state in a civil war. In one sense, Bangladesh belongs to a group of countries founded in Cold War partitions, others being the two Yemens, Koreas, and Vietnams. But in another, it represents the contemporary logic of state-making, in which it is the post-colonial nation that must give way for a new political form. And it is in this way, too, that Bangladesh can be said to close the historical period of post-colonialism. The civil wars that have given rise to new countries after the Cold War, from the Balkans to the Caucasus and Africa to Central Asia, are testament to this new logic. And the incomplete civil wars that rage in post-colonial states like Iraq and Syria only augment it. In many cases, of course, such wars end by the intervention of the international order that almost invariably turns these countries into its dependence as part of the old narrative of humanitarianism. Such indeed had once been the fate of Bangladesh, whose current problems can be said to stem in part from the struggle of her people to divest themselves of the depoliticized language, both of humanitarianism and the neoliberalism that succeeded it. But Bangladesh also and increasingly serves as the founding example of a new political logic in which states emerge out of civil wars and not in any other way. And by civil war, of course, one means also the loss of citizenship itself. It is as if once the nation state became the normative unit of international law and politics after decolonization, and even more so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, new polities could only emerge by splitting them. Of course, this does not always require a civil war, since agreements too can do the same work, as illustrated by the division of Czechoslovakia. But the division of states by agreement tends to have as its context the pooling of sovereignty within larger federal structures such as the European Union. This ironically means that separated or divided nations have a new kind of intimacy as their condition of possibility, all of which suggests that Scotland and Catalonia might be other states in the making. And even where these new polities have emerged out of violent civil wars to claim distinct sovereignties, new cooperative, if not quite federal structures are capable of making them intimates again. This possibility faces Bangladesh as well as India and Pakistan, just as it does North and South Korea. The case of national reunification with Germany, Vietnam, and Yemen as its most prominent examples remains yet another kind of possibility. Now, Carl Schmitt feared the possibility of a world pacified by humanitarianism, one in which politics was replaced by crime and the expulsion of the enemy from humanity. The disappearance of politics presumed the emergence of a world no longer divided into a plurality of jurisdictions, legitimized not by agreements so much as the possibility of war. Such a situation could be envisioned in terms of a world state, another name for an all-powerful international order. But its claims to universality might also be considered in a non-humanitarian and even political way that Schmitt named a global civil war. He thought such a thing was both conceptualized and made possible by the Soviet Union, whose revolutionary ideology recognized no limits and operated by way of class conflict. While class conflict never resulted in a global civil war, might we espy its possibility in the absolute normativity of the nation state itself? While we tend to focus on international interventions and inveigh against the hypocritical humanitarianism when discussing war in our own times, these are often, if not invariably, preceded or followed by civil wars. Such conflicts are, of course, frequently prompted or sustained by external interventions of many kinds, but their reality requires recognition in its own right, from Afghanistan to Libya and beyond. Their ubiquity as a political form or a genre, I would like to suggest, has everything to do with the end of postcolonialism. And the event that set off this new political logic was arguably the founding of Bangladesh in 1971. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. Provocative as always, and I wish we had we had met in person and everyone could have then picked your brains after this, whether you'd have liked it or not. I'd really hope to see this out in print, and I think we'll all be really looking forward to seeing what sorts of reactions you get, because I'm sure you'll manage to annoy a lot of people, as well as obviously, provide everyone with more food for thought. But thank you so much. We're very grateful. I'd like to hand over to Filippo now.
Thanks, Indrajit, and thanks very much, Professor Devji, for such an insightful and really wide-ranging and provocative keynote speech at today's conference. It was really fascinating to hear, your take on the 1971 war and this idea of Bangladesh as the founding example of a new political logic through which states emerge, which I thought was really interesting. So just, I won't take more time. I'll just want to, on behalf of all the organizers, panelists, and those of members of the audience that have joined us for this keynote, I would like to thank you for being with us today and for sharing with us your thoughts, your insights, and your perspective. So thank you very much. And I'm sure a lot of the themes that you have touched on will be followed up in the coming sessions that we have today, starting with session 3 on territory, which is really about to start. So once again, our sincerest gratitude for being with us today. And I will now hand over to Indrajit, who will introduce the next session. So Indrajit, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And Faisal, if we could have, we'd have given you a round of applause.